Good day everyone. Today we are going to be doing a walkthrough on life science lesson for grade 10 learners on cells, the basic unit of life. In this lesson we are going to cover some basic cell structure as well as movement of substances across the membrane and the different types of transport that occurs there. Okay, so once your learners are in the class and settled, they will be greeted with this first slide over here, and you're going to begin with your hook question. Ask the learners what is the smallest unit of life that they can think of. Wait for their responses. While you are getting the responses, you can hand out your cell membrane or cell structure and membrane transport worksheet. Wait for the responses, and once you get to the right answer, which is a cell, explain to them that the worksheet that you've just handed out, they are going to have to complete as the lesson progresses. Okay. Continue with the introduction after that. Explain to the learners that because cells come in different shapes and sizes, and even they do come in different shapes and sizes, they all have the same structure, which is the cell membrane, the nucleus, and the cytoplasm. Now you can draw just a basic diagram like this on the board to help visually explain what structures you are talking about in that cell. Right. After you have explained that, you ask the learners how cells control what goes in and out and why is it so important. Now this is a rhetorical question, it's just to get the learners thinking. Before they get a chance to answer, you go to your next slide and you're going to provide the lesson outline. So you'll explain to the learners that you are going to be discussing the basic structure of a cell today, as well as focusing specifically on the cell membrane and the fluid mosaic model, and how that allows substances in and out of the cell, which brings you to your transport mechanisms. Okay, so you continue with your lesson onto the development stage. We introduce the three basic cell parts. First of all, the nucleus. Explain to the learners that the nucleus is the brain of the cell, it's the control center, and it contains the DNA. Those are the key parts there. You go over to the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the jelly-like substance where all the organelles are floating, and then you continue with the cell membrane. Now the cell membrane is broken up into two parts. First, you'll just discuss briefly the function of the cell membrane, and then we'll move into the structure. Now before you do that, remind the learners that it doesn't matter what type of cell you're working with, whether it's a plant cell or animal cell, all cells have these three basic structures. Okay, so your cell membrane is the flexible outer boundary that controls what enters and leaves the cell. Okay. You move on to your next slide, which is the fluid mosaic model, which describes the structure of the cell membrane. There are two important things you're focusing on here. Number one, obviously, it's used to explain how substances enter and exit the cell. And then secondly, you have your phospholipid bilayer, which is very important, as well as the membrane proteins. So phospholipid bilayer, you're going to focus on the hydrophilic heads and the hydrophobic tails. Explain to the learners that these are important for osmosis, which we'll get to later, and then together they form a protective barrier. And secondly, the membrane proteins are used for transport of substances in and out of the cell. Ask learners, how does the membrane allow substances in and out of the cell? And this is your introduction question into transport types. So you will go to the next slide. Explain to the learners that there are two types of transport which we work with: passive transport and active transport. Passive transport, we have diffusion and osmosis, and then active transport just stays active transport. Key differences there: active transport requires energy and it moves substances against the concentration gradient, where passive transport doesn't require energy and they generally move from a high concentration to a low concentration. From there, you go into your passive transport or diffusion. Now for diffusion, we have a nice demonstration which we can show the learners. You'll start off with the definition that it's the movement of particles or molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration, and that we are going to demonstrate how this works. Now before you do the demonstration, speak to the learners, make sure there are no learners with asthma problems or respiratory problems. If there are learners that have asthma problems or respiratory problems, suggest moving them to a well-ventilated area, or even at maybe like the door of the classroom or whatever the case may be, so that they are not affected. Okay, so for the demonstration, you're going to need deodorant, perfume, air freshener, anything that smells nice, and you're going to move into the corner of the classroom. You're going to spray a bit of your perfume or deodorant, and then you're going to ask learners to raise their hands when they smell the air freshener or perfume or whatever it is you are using. This is a nice demonstration because the area where you sprayed your air freshener or whatever the case may be, whatever resource you are using, that area is high in concentration of those aerosol molecules, and then it moves through the classroom to the lower concentration areas where eventually it balances out. When you're done with diffusion, you move to osmosis. Explain that osmosis is the movement of water molecules from high water potential to low water potential, and this affects the structure of the cell. So we have three states that it creates. It's an isotonic state where it's equal concentration, there's no water movement. The second one is the hypotonic state, where there's a low concentration inside the cell, so water moves from outside the cell into the cell, making it firm, turgid. And then lastly, the hypertonic state, where there's a low concentration outside of the cell, so the water moves from inside the cell outside the cell, causing the cell to shrink or become flaccid. You move back then to active transport. It requires, again, remind the learners that it requires energy for the cell to do active transport, and it only does active transport when it wants to get substances into the cell that it requires. So it's going to use energy to get those substances. Remind the learners as well that in active transport, the cell is bringing substance in against a concentration gradient. Very, very important. Okay. After you've done explaining the transport mechanisms, you're moving into a consolidation phase. Provide a quick recap on the last slide to get the learners on the same page, and from here we can go into a question and answer session, clarify any misconceptions. Once that is done, we can ask learners to write down in their books for their exit ticket one type of passive transport, one thing that requires energy to move across a membrane, and one word to describe the membrane structure. While they are doing this, you provide them with their homework questions and get them to do their homework. Thank you.